Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, at the beginning of this trial, I told you that the evidence would show that Mr. Ward, the defendant in this case, pointed a gun 12 to 18 inches away from his wife's face and pulled the trigger, killing her nearly instantly. And that is what the evidence has shown beyond a reasonable doubt. Now again, why? How did this come to be? How did this happen? Married couples fight. You don't need testimony to hear married couples fight. You don't need to hear testimony that married couples fight over money. But what do we have in this case? We have people who are under a lot of financial stress, much like a lot of people back in those years. But you heard how it's affecting them, both on antidepressants, both stressed out. Bond Safeguard Insurance Company is repoing cars out of the driveway in Atlanta, taking photographs of Mrs. Ward. She retreats down to Orlando. So while we have no idea what caused that argument that night, could have been dinner, could have been on the television, Fox News was on that one room that was left on, we'll get to that. Who knows? But we do know that a couple hours later, Mr. Ward, the defendant, sends an email saying, "I hope you're all happy. Diane killed herself tonight." And that just wasn't to any random people. That was to his lawyer, her lawyer, the bankruptcy trustee, and the bankruptcy trustee's attorney. So clearly, it seems to be on his mind. So there's certainly motivation for an argument. And when you combine that with stress, alcohol, medication, unsecured firearms, this can be a recipe for what we have seen, second-degree murder. A killing not done with the intent to kill, but out of anger, spite, argument. And so how do we know that there was some sort of argument? Well, there's a broken wine glass down on the patio, spilled wine on the nice tile and inside the grout, wine all over the back of Mr. Ward's shirt, and then that wine is transferred upstairs. You can see the photographs onto his pillow, as was so adamantly argued, that that's his side of the bed, and the sheets there. So there was an argument. Clearly, Mr. Ward went upstairs, and then that's when the shooting occurred. So let's talk about a few different things. Motive. Motive isn't an element of the crime. You just heard the instructions. Motive is something you hear on television, and it's nice to help explain some stories, but not this story. Motive isn't even an element of first-degree murder. First-degree murder, a premeditated intent to kill somebody, well, it could be over money, it could be over any number of things that are motive, but all the state would have to prove in that case is premeditated intent to kill, even if there's no evidence of motive. And in this case, it's second-degree murder. Hatred, ill will, spite, grumpy feelings, does something that could kill her, and he did. So that's second-degree murder. Now, it was brought up in openings that Mr. Ward would have no motive to do this. Well, again, we don't have to prove that it did. This is an argument that went horribly, horribly wrong. But as far as these finances, let's just talk about that really quickly. The argument was made that Diane Ward being alive is the saving grace to the Ward's financial empire because his creditors can only go after him, not their marital property, not her property. But, as you just heard in the instructions, if he's the one that causes her death intentionally and unlawfully, that marital property gets split up like they were roommates instead of husband and wife, and he only gets 50% of the marital property. But what do we already know is going on? Bond Safeguard Insurance Company filed a $7.5 million lawsuit, not just against Mr. Ward, but also against Mrs. Ward. So that breaches this tenancy by the entireties anyways. And so if she's dead and he unintentionally and unlawfully did it, Bond Safeguard's going to have to get a judgment against her estate and him anyways. So nothing changes. The finances, while they were arguing about it, surely, that's not the motive for anyone to be killed or not killed. Gunshot residue. There's a reason I didn't mention it in opening statements. You may remember. maybe you don't, but I didn't mention it in opening statements, and that's because they don't even do it anymore. They went from 2 stamps a hand to 1 stamp a hand to no stamps a hand. And what do we know at the end of the day? When a firearm gets discharged, some GSR from the primer, the heavy metal elements, antimony, lead, barium, gets sprayed out like in a waffle ice cream cone in front up to 10, 15 feet, and then in a 360-degree radius, up to 6 foot in diameter, 4 to 6 diameter, it gets sprayed in a 360-degree area. So obviously, Mrs. Ward is there when the gun goes off. Mr. Ward says he's there. So what are we learning from this? Because there are things you can't learn from it. You can't learn who had their hand on the gun. You can't learn any of that things. The gunshot residue that comes out the barrel is the same as the gunshot residue that comes out the cylinder. Doesn't tell you anything about what happened, other than were you there for a gunshot residue event or not. The processing of the scene. Again, this is a domestic case. There's no electrified fence like at Guantanamo Bay separating Mr. Ward's side of the bedroom and Mrs. Ward's side of the bedroom. At any point in time, if Mr. Ward had just said, hey, Diane, can you grab this out of my nightstand? Or maybe she did. You could have a thumbprint or a fingerprint there, and that doesn't tell you anything about who went into that nightstand on that night. And same for the holster. That doesn't tell you anything. If it was left, if there was DNA left by Mrs. Ward on that, that doesn't tell you that it happened that night. And if there wasn't any DNA on it, that doesn't mean she didn't touch it that night. So you can have a false positive, a false negative. That's why it doesn't mean anything. Let's talk about the DNA. DNA, touch DNA in particular, what we're interested in this particular case, depends on person. You can be a shedder or not so much of a shedder. Depends on the surface you touch, but it also depends on things like the force of friction. And when a .357 Magnum firearm goes off, there is going to be kickback. And it's going to rub against your hand. And that's going to be a shedding event, potential shedding event for anybody. And what's on the DNA that was taken from the grip and from the trigger? Now mind you, the trigger, very, very tiny surface area compared to the grip. So there's one thing. And it's very, very smooth compared to the rough grip. What does it tell you? You can see the peaks. We went over a couple of them. We were talking about the Rocky Mountains when it comes to Mr. Ward's DNA. And even after they do everything they possibly can to develop this minor profile, mixing it, turning the amplification up from 10 seconds to 22 seconds, the only witness in this case who has ever actually done DNA analysis using PCR, this amplification process we discussed, the only person who's ever done that in her life says, no, even when you do that, there's not enough to say that even a minor profile of Mrs. Ward is there. And remember, at 3 or 4 locations, there's some other dude or dudette at that, on the gun. And that doesn't mean that that third person had touched the gun either. So the DNA, you know what causes it. The friction of a firearm being discharged would certainly cause DNA to get shed. Now let's talk about the mixture of the samples. Look, even mixing it and amplifying it 220%, a minor profile doesn't get developed. So you want to know who handled the firearm. Everybody who was asked either refused to look at it and try, or said, there's no way to fire a gun without holding the grip. In particular, this gun. This gun has a heavy trigger pull, according to witnesses. This gun can go back there upon your request, and you can pull the trigger and see what the trigger pull feels like, both in normal usage and if you were so inclined to awkwardly 180 degrees, 12 to 18 inches from your face, try to pull the trigger. And I do emphasize try. So that's the DNA. I would submit that mixing it only helped to try and develop a minor profile. Blood patterns. Well, we'll get to that later, but no blood on the gun, no blood on Mr. Ward's hands, no blood on Mr. Ward's arms. So what do we know? That this is above the bloodshed event that ends up on his shorts, on the floor, on the bed, on the wall. And Mrs. Ward, well, there's certainly some blood on her that got transferred from when she's down on the ground, which would cause some spatter when she lands and then continues to bleed out. But on the back of her right hand, The defense expert, Stuart James, said, yeah, on the back of her right hand, I don't see a satellite event there. That's back spatter, which means her hand is somewhere closer and in a different location than the gun that doesn't have blood on it. And she's right-handed. Distance determination. All right. Basically, at the end of the day, it's this subjective call. It's not like the electron microscope that used to do GSR when that was a thing. There's no little machine that's going to carve out a square inch and say, oh, there's this many particles and this is the density per inch or whatever. It's a subjective call. And what everybody on both the state and the defense side is 12 to 18 inches. And Dr. Anderson says, well, 14 to 18 inches. So state will go with that. Friends and family. All right. Mrs. Ward liked to drink her wine. Loud, crazy Italian woman. I'm sure everybody knows somebody in their life like that. She was also being prescribed medications. From at least 1998, she's been on antidepressants. It's not her first day taking antidepressants. One of her daughters can say, oh, she'd forget and then retake her medication. But according to their toxicologist, the defense, even though it's not a perfect linear science, she would have had to have forgotten 3 or 4 times and taken 12 pills approximately to even begin to get in that range that day. So, that's kind of asking y'all to speculate that she did that when there's no testimony or evidence that she did that. She talked to several people on the phone that day. Everything seemed fine, including her friend Georgia Spearman. Talked to her for 37 minutes, right around 6:30 at night, about an hour 20 minutes before she gets shot. So there's that. Then her doctor says, yeah, she's on edge. The finances are bothering her from 2007, 2008, 2009. The doctor knows she's mixing wine and pills. She's still prescribing the pills. She knows that she's tried to refer her out to a psychiatrist and she hasn't gone, but she hasn't Baker acted her or thought she was going to harm herself or harm anybody else. So same thing for the toxicology. There's just too many loose ends with the citalopram levels. I mean, when we talked to Dr. Anderson this morning, all of a sudden, after, since 2011, when he said there was hallucinations, anxiety, and hostility, whatever, now he suddenly remembers, oh yeah, my source for looking at this toxicology stuff was this web page, and yeah, sure enough, it does list how frequent these things happen. And somnolence, sleepiness was like 18-21%, nausea is like 20-21%, and then down there, anxiety and confusion was less than 1%, anxiety was 4%. Now that's what Dr. Goldberger said also, is that those side effects would be pretty rare. What you would expect from a central nervous system depressant, particularly if you take too much of it, particularly if you take it with trazodone, particularly if you take it with ethanol, would be like what they're using in these commercials now, the 3-toed tree sloths that do Pictionary in slow motion and play catch with frisbees in super slow motion. She would have balance issues, slurring her words, lethargy, fine motor skill problems, gross motor skill problems. But yet this is the woman that Mr. Ward in his third story says snuck up behind him like a wraith, and we'll get to that. But you just don't know what, if any, side effects were present. The best evidence would be the people that had been talking with her that day and spent time with her. And so you do have one version of everybody who says she's fine, her daughters, Georgia Spearman, and then you have the defendant's third version of his story where now she's this hostile person standing behind him with a gun. Now, make no mistake, I consider throwing wine at somebody to be hostile, but not probably in the same neighborhood as pulling a gun and pointing it at somebody. And we know that gun, the wine did not get on his back through magic. That was thrown at him. There's a broken wine glass. He says that she was the one drinking wine. But ladies and gentlemen, like we were discussing with Dr. Anderson this morning, you can do that sober and you can do that drunk. Throwing a glass of wine does not require you to turn into Dr. Jekyll from your medication, or another more modern example is when the yellow minions in those cute little movies turn into the purple minions, the monsters. You don't have to be a monster to throw a glass of wine at somebody. Let's talk about the defendant's 3 stories. There are simply some things that don't change in this world. The laws of nature, and we'll discuss that in a little bit, I get to come back up after Mr. Gillen. I know you're thrilled that I get to talk to you twice. But the other thing that doesn't change is the truth. And you heard from Dr. Bluck this morning, a couple of things that influence your memory and your reliability of your memory is recency and a significant emotional event. So when Mr. Ward calls 911, and we have no idea how soon or late after he shot Mrs. Ward did he do that, other than after the 37-minute phone call with Georgia Spearman. When he calls 911, you heard his tone of voice. You'll be able to hear it again as many times as you want. You will be getting a computer to go look at all the digital evidence again, the photographs, the peaks and the charts, and listen to this 911 call, listen to his Channel 13 interview. Story number one, quickly after the event, perhaps immediately, or anywhere, like I said, in that time frame after the end of that last phone call on the phone records. I just shot my wife. Says that 5 times. I just shot my wife. She's dead. She's gone. I'm sorry. Now, to contrast that to some of the Channel 13 interview, he calls 911 because she needs help. He doesn't know what's wrong. He doesn't know where she's shot. But we'll get to that. So that's the first story. Most recent, emotionally significant event, should be, a significant emotional event should be. Then the second story, the second version, a couple hours later, is that email that is subject, you bastards, body of the text, I hope y'all are happy. Diane killed herself tonight, Bob Ward. Now, wasn't sent to random people. I didn't get the email, you all didn't get the email, but the bankruptcy attorney did, the trustee, his attorney, and her attorney. So clearly, that seems to be on his mind. Then 2 years later, 2011, now this is the story. I fell asleep on the porch that afternoon, or the evening, one of those. I have no idea how that broken wine glass got there. I have no idea how that spilled wine got there. In fact, I have no idea how all that wine got on the back of my shirt and my shorts and the swab from the inside of his right ankle. And so he wakes up. His wife's not around. So he's going to go up and go to bed. Leaves the TV on, goes up the stairs. No sign of Mrs. Ward. No sound of Mrs. Ward. Goes up one of those 2 sets of stairs, or the elevator. Got 3 options in this house. During this whole trek, this whole journey, if they had eye watches then, it would have been many, many, many steps. Gets to his nightstand. And still, no sign of Mrs. Ward. I'm just going to go to bed. Taking my stuff out of my pockets. I'm putting it on the nightstand. Now, what's on the nightstand? Is there stuff like that would come out of men's pockets? It's the only thing on the nightstand of those pictures that Kelly Wood took was a laptop ThinkPad and a holster. So there's nothing on the nightstand. There's nothing that gets dropped out of his hands onto the floor when, lo and behold, without a sound, Mrs. Ward sneaks up on him, behind him. And they're this close in the Channel 13 interview. Mind you, Dr. Anderson says they're 14 inches. His own expert. And now, in an instant, the gun goes from being pointed at him into a 180-degree turn, and it just goes off. Now, he later says, well, obviously it didn't just go off. Somebody had to pull the trigger. But 2 years later, he doesn't know who pulled the trigger. And think about the dynamics of turning somebody's hand 180 degrees. I mean, we're talking pitchers and catchers just reported. We're talking major league curveball, whether it's with his right hand or left hand, to snap her wrist around 180 degrees on her. And that's his story. Well, that's one of his 3 stories. The truth doesn't change. And in those jury instructions that you just read, or had read to you, both, inconsistent statements. And you got to imagine why he's making these inconsistent statements. Because he has an interest in the outcome of this case. That's why he said 3 different things. And that's why you're not getting the truth. And we'll talk about more why the scientific evidence in this case shows you exactly what happened, because just like the truth doesn't change, neither do the laws of nature.